Hello everybody, I'm Naveen, and we at Mind Matter try to build a platform for relevant discussions on issues that we think will improve the worldview of students at UNIP and our viewers on YouTube. This is Virat. He's also a student at UNIP, just like me. He studies business and I study psychology. And we have here Mr. Bill Cohn. We already have had a podcast with him in which he mentioned a lot of his opinions, and we sort of try to get to the gist of things, of what we think about freedom of speech in the conventional sense. Now, Thomas Hobbes, an English philosopher, he tried to say that social contract and obedience, these sort of combined, sort of says what democracy is and how basically control works against how people conform to the society. In this context, together, what do you think? Which side do you think you lean towards?
You're doing it again. You're polarizing things as being either or. That's the fallacy of the false alternative. Firstly, I think it's John Locke who, was the philosopher that, established the notion of the social contract whereby the government gets its legitimacy via the consent of the governed. And I don't really know how Hobbes weighed in on this question. Hobbes had a different take on human nature and how we should order society. The notion that liberty and security are opposed to each other, I think, is misplaced. I think it's the conventional wisdom that there's a trade-off between freedom and security.
Okay, hold on.
Huh?
We might have a problem.
What was that, Peter?
Hold on, please.
What is the problem?
I can put the stream online. Just doesn't work.
Also, we're not live.
What happened? We lost our feed or something?
We never went live.
Sorry about that. Just trying to fix it.
Okay, I'm going to start with John Locke then. So
What was it?
we'll start with John Locke then instead of me mentioning Thomas Hobbes.
What the hell is Hobbes?
What the fuck are you talking Take two.
All right. So we cannot have absolute freedom and absolute security, is what people think, especially Sarah Palin, who stood with, who was a vice presidential candidate in the McCain campaign. And so, what do you think about that?
Again, viewers, we already did this and it wasn't technically happening. So again, I'll say that I think that's conventional wisdom that, freedom and security are opposed to each other. I believe that the conventional understanding of the term security is a false notion of security. It's a notion of security which disrespects the social contract that you referenced previously in terms of government getting its authority and legitimacy through an informed citizenry, delegating authority to those who are supposed to represent them. Rather than working that way, the social contract is broken because of the powers of mass media and propaganda in order to instill a notion of security, which is militarized, essentially. The most secure society is one in which everybody has enough to eat, everybody has a job, everybody has privacy and freedom to be able to live their life as they wish without harming others.
How about everybody has a gun? Is it still a secure society?
I don't think so. I think that the notion of gun rights is misplaced. We could get into the way in which the NRA has gotten the courts to read the Second Amendment in a way that it was never previously understood for 200 years.
All right.
That's the influence of money in politics. So.
Let me rephrase that a little bit. I don't want to get into the gun argument.
No, but just before we...
You started it.
Just before we
I just was giving an example.
like, what money are you talking about? I mean, the NRA is insignificant in its lobbying, in the amount of money it spends in lobbying.
It's not significant?
It's completely insignificant. It's not in the top 30 of the biggest lobbyists in Congress. I mean, the reason why the influential is because there's 70 million gun owners in the US.
Yeah, you can talk about hunting, you can talk about culture, but I would contend that it.
For as long as Americans think guns are cool, guns will be legal in the US.
Have you seen the Michael Moore film Bowling for Columbine?
Yes, I did.
Okay, so you know the wonderful scene where he talks about the fear that Americans have because of their history of genocide and slavery and stuff, and so that's why guns are so important to them, because at the end of the day they don't have security. If you need a gun to feel secure, you're insecure.
What about this? Like I said, I don't want to get into the gun argument because there are a lot of opposing points of view.
But no, you were saying before that this feeling of security can often be induced by the media and is fake very often times, and I would argue that's the case in the rest of the world. We're not much safer than the United States.
Yeah, no, I'm not.
We just feel safer, so we don't feel the need to defend ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, look, American gun culture is part of this American exceptionalism thing, and every country has its own history that informs why it is the way it is, and I think that if you need a gun, it's a show of weakness, not strength. I don't think you're secure if you feel you need to sleep with a rifle in order to sleep at night.
But there are people with psychological problems who feel insecure. How do you account for that? And besides, let's take gun out of the equation. Let's put a knife there. People with arms in general, let it not be guns. People with arms in general sort of suspend security. So, and a society cannot exist without weaponized things like knife, for example, which is almost similar to gun in the place when it comes to close quarters.
If you say so, Naveen.
What do you think? No, tell me.
I think that I would refer the viewers to the scholarship of Henry Giroux. That's Henry Giroux. He wrote a piece called The National Insecurity State. I think it very well goes to my point that the notion of security is a false one that serves certain sectors of society in terms of their commercial interests or their bureaucratic interests and their worldview. Why are you smiling?
What sections of society?
Huh?
What sections of society does it serve?
Who benefits from the fighting of wars and the selling of weapons? Weapons producers, the politicians who are cooperating closely with weapons producers because they're giving them funding and providing jobs in their home state. I mean, you know, Dwight Eisenhower in his farewell address to the nation in 1962 warned America about the growing and unwarranted influence of the military-industrial complex, and it's mutated. Now we've got the security and intelligence complex because we've technologically changed the way that we fight wars, but it's still the same thing of creating a sense of security based on the Trumpian notion of security, based on the Bushian notion of security, based on the Obama notion of security. Every American president has had the same notion of security, that is to protect the homeland from foreign enemies. But I thought we were going to be discussing like Facebook and Cambridge Analytica and privacy. We'll get to that, but it's the same thing. The only reason why like Mark Zuckerberg is being called before Congress to testify and stuff and having to do his PR campaign on this is because of the fear of foreigners. It's this fear of Russia. It's the old Cold War thing, which works so well in order to justify military spending and weapons sales.
That was a complete showpiece. Like it was just like to calm down the American public because he wasn't put under oath, so he could lie. He lied for 10 hours basically. And,
it's all a big dog and pony show. There's no real desire for anybody to do anything except to placate the public because the public's pissed off.
Exactly.
And so the politicians feel like they have to pretend like they're holding his feet to the fire, but at the end of the day, it's like summed up by the introductory remarks. It's like, you know, the senator looks to Zuckerberg and he says, Mr. Zuckerberg, if you and your other technology companies can't get this problem under control, then none of us are going to have any privacy. Putting the burden on the private sector to regulate itself, saying, we don't want to do our job. It's the job of government to establish regulations through law that govern protecting their citizens. Congress has completely punted on this. They're looking to Silicon Valley to self-regulate it, as they've been doing for the past 15 years. It's a farce.
I'm sorry, Mr. Cohn. Can we come back to that later? Before we talk about the digital age and how this virtual accessibility thing has changed our freedom, our notion of freedom and security, let's talk about it in a more conventional sense of things. For example, hate speech. Yeah? And there was a question that was posed to you from our last podcast with you that we couldn't actually tell you during the podcast. One of the viewers actually accused you of racially charged language and went on to say that it does not fall under the umbrella of freedom of speech because of many judgments that have been made in the US courts. What do you think about that?
I don't understand. What racially charged language was I accused of doing?
During class, the person mentioned in the comments.
Tell me what was said. You're speaking.
It's exactly like that. It's exactly like that. That racially charged language was used by you in class. What about those accusations?
That's not what we're here to discuss.
All right.
What is this?
All right.
Is this an exercise in innuendo?
No, I'm just asking. Do you think that is hate speech? If people
the
do
issue
that
came up in the viewer comments in terms of like what the law was that, you know, it's like at the time I didn't see it, but subsequently when you sent me the link, the YouTube link, I could see the viewer comments, and there was a viewer who was repeatedly saying that I was wrong in my presentation of what the law is. And so I sent that viewer a link to show him that the precedent that he was calling to is not in fact the valid law today. That the Chaplinsky versus New Hampshire ruling that established the fighting words doctrine has been completely diluted and watered down because the courts in a series of rulings from RAV versus St. Paul to Snyder v. Phelps has said this is protected speech, offensive speech, those things that might like offend somebody, and what was traditionally considered fighting words isn't a doctrine that has force anymore. And you know, just for the viewers to know the record straight on this, I sent you the link too.
Yes.
You chose not to post it. So it's like, if we want to have accuracy in this and have...
No, but posted where? Where should I have posted it?
You run this
I know, but
platform.
this is the place to talk about it, so you can talk about it. That's what I'm saying. Anyways, my question is, hate speech, it sort of impedes freedom of speech. Let's talk about that. What do you think about that, Vidal?
I mean, like racially charged language or whatever you call it is not. Well, I mean, you call it hate speech, but all hate speech is free speech. I mean,
All free speeches.
I mean,
even something that inflicts immediate violence is free speech.
what do you mean inflicts immediate violence? Words don't inflict violence.
At all?
And one more thing, in terms of accuracy, the viewer who I sent the link to also used quotation marks to say that I said things in our initial podcast from just over a month ago. And if you're going to put quotation marks in somebody's words and assign to them the words that they've used, at least be accurate. Anybody can go back and check. The quote that he ascribed to me is inaccurate. Listen to what I said and look. So, it's like I don't really understand why it is that you're kind of like working this angle on me. You've asked me to give my time to be here to discuss certain things. So what is this about?
I only wanted to know your opinion. Anyways, let's move on from
We talked about it last time. Freedom for the thought I hate. The true test of your commitment to free speech is whether you're willing to allow people whose views you find most offensive and disagreeable to you to say what they want to say.
I believe one of the formulas they used in one of the judgments was non-offensive speech doesn't need protecting.
What?
Non-offensive speech doesn't need protecting because no one's offended. Nobody cares.
Yeah, right.
Popular speech, okay, good, nobody cares, so it doesn't need protecting. So only offensive, unpopular speech.
Yeah. Okay.
So
It's a simple doctrine. It's just, I want to.
In the sense of like, it has to
If
be
you're asking me
unpopular
my views on hate speech, I would like to provide a little nuance on this because, in fact, just because you have a legal right to do something doesn't mean you should do it. From an ethical standpoint, I believe that people should be more cautious in the way that they speak. It's like I'm reminded when, like the NSA was spying on Angela Merkel and their allies. They could do it. Is it wise to spy on your allies and friends? No, because they're going to find out someday, and it's like an embarrassing thing to do. So it's like the law is that hateful speech is protected. That doesn't mean that people should speak with hate and anger. People should try to learn and listen and have tolerance. And one of the problems that I sense in terms of the correspondence of the viewers and when I look at this platform is the problem of the digital age. People fall into their information cocoons and their filter bubbles, and everything is polarized. It's reflected in the questions that you ask. I believe that the only way for people to truly learn from each other and in order to be able to get greater understanding is to unplug and meet face to face and talk. But nobody wants to do that anymore because they're happy just firing off their little tweets. How are you going to say anything and tell that? How many characters are allowed in a tweet? I've never used any of this stuff. I don't use Facebook. I don't use any social media. I don't use Twitter.
Is that because you think it jeopardizes your security or something?
No, I do plenty of things that jeopardize my security. I go online all the time and do searches
But
and
why
send emails
don't
and stuff.
you use Facebook and all these social media platforms?
Because I think it's a major distraction and drain. I think it dumbs down discourse. Because essentially it's just a marketing tool. People use it to, pardon the expression, pimp themselves up, call attention to themselves. It's like, let's leave it at that.
All right.
Continue.
In the recent ages, do you think language consensus has sort of deteriorated? I'll tell you where I'm coming from. Have you heard of Jordan Peterson?
Jordan Peterson?
Yes.
No.
He's a very controversial clinical psychologist from Canada. You've probably heard about it, right? And he thinks that the language consensus among people has gone down gradually because of how polarized political opinions have gotten. I'll give you an example of this.
What do you mean by the language consensus?
Okay.
I think what he's talking about is something that, I think it's related, it kind of sounds like what happens in 1984, where because of the removal of languages or the distancing between the proles and the normal citizens in the language they use, it completely degrades the cohesion between the people and also degrades people's ability to express themselves and to communicate with each other because they no longer have the tools to do so.
What I mean is, if I
says what?
If I say a word and I mean something, you do not understand it because you live in your own social bubble, in your own political bubble, and so there is no proper conveyance happening. There is a gap because of the political divide.
There's a great example of this. I'll always remember it. It's if maybe it was on the news. There was a guy who was invited to speak about I think the First Amendment, and he said, "I love there's two things I love, and that's the First Amendment and boobs." And
booze?
And boobs.
And boobs.
Yes.
Boots?
No, boobs.
Oh, with a
and the TV presenter, who was a woman, immediately got offended and said, "Oh, how dare you, blah, 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 blah." And went on like this. So what I saw happening is the guy was saying, "I believe in the First Amendment and my right to use it." And what the woman heard is, "I believe in the First Amendment and the objectification of women," and whatever else you want to add to that. So he's like, they're both hearing, and he's saying, she's hearing. It's the same thing, but they're understanding something completely different because of their biases.
Well, he's a jerk. I mean, if you're talking about free speech, you can talk about it without that's silly to my mind. So, yeah, there's a problem with language, dumbing down of language. Think about it. Think about the way in which language is used digitally. Everything is an emoticon. Everything is an abbreviation. OMG, WYD. It's like, it's the dumbing down of the mind because language is the way in which we communicate. So I don't know what Jordan Peterson says. Do you want to tell me what he says?
Okay. In terms of context, yeah? Language has a lot of contextual implications. The same language can be used and in two different contexts, completely different things can be understood.
Of course.
And basically, because of the political divide that is happening between the extreme left and the extreme right, people, what is being expressed is understood completely differently between the left and the right. Thank you so much. Is what I'm saying. And what do you think about this? Is it actually a phenomenon?
I think you're a product of the problem we're discussing. I think your tendency to bifurcate everything as being polarized, extreme left, extreme right, it's much deeper than that. It has to do with the common people not having access to the tools that they need in order to be able to discern truth value in things.
The thing is, they do have access, they just don't have knowledge, they don't know that they have access to these things.
Well,
you need to, the awareness needs to be there.
Yeah, media literacy, but it's like
it's more than media literacy.
What is it?
The ability to go and look at the stuff yourself, to go on the web, to go look at a few sources.
Curiosity.
Yes, curiosity.
And refined curiosity at that.
Yeah, but let's give a reality check to that. It's like there may be exceptional people out there who have found a way to sift through the minefield of disinformation on the web in order to know where to go. But it's like basically most people are like swimming in a toilet bowl. And you're saying, there's a drop of good water in there. Drink it, enjoy it. It's like, if you step back, I think that's like, yeah, what you say about language, what you say about this is all true. So it's like, where do we go from here, Naveen? This is your show.
I'll tell you. So the next point is political correctness.
Political correctness.
Yes. Do you think political correctness in the current epoch has limited our freedom of speech in any way? And both of you can contribute to this. The way...
After you, Virat.
Well,
if you need more explanation, I can...
No, but in one way I want to say obviously because it's political correctness. It's about fitting in with whatever.
Sure, but then again, it's freedom of speech. You can say whatever you want.
No, I'm saying that they contradict each other. You can't have both. Or you can have sort of like a prevailing, you can have a zeitgeist, which is sort of going on, which is politically correct, and then people who are not politically correct get ostracized in this. But this is not governmental. But it is
a bit governmental. I'll give you an example. In
Canada, it's created in the government.
In Canada right now, they have sort of cut down on the personal pronouns that you can refer to with people, and so it's almost illegal to call.
Not quite like that. Basically, what they've done is they've added gender pronouns as an expression of your identity. And that can be covered. It is covered under the Canadian Charter of Human Rights. So what that means is that when you misgender somebody, you're violating their human rights, and you don't even go to a criminal court or a civil court. What you go to is a social justice tribunal.
And what's your opinion on this?
The irony of it, which is not even, a competent court. So I'm like, this is ridiculous.
Is it correct?
Well, it's relevant to language as well, because my daughter got an acceptance letter from Brown University a year back, and I'd be sure it was a typo. It's like they kept referring to her with a plural pronoun of they. It was in fact a letter to me and my wife, to the parents, congratulations on the success of your child.
Okay.
And they kept referring to our daughter Catherine as they rather than she. And I was like, oh boy, did they screw up. And then my brother found out that this was a decision that they made in order to respect gender neutrality. They didn't want to box anybody into a gender. So it's like, I think everybody has the right to autonomy and self-determination, so long as you're not harming other people. You can choose to be called whatever you want and self-identify as whatever you want. But if you're going to debase the means by which we communicate, that I think. So this is just one example of political correctness. There was in the academy, in universities in the United States and elsewhere, there's a real chilling effect on the part of scholars because there is a sense that certain things can't be said anymore that are not vulgar or anything. It's just an expression of viewpoint and stuff, and so it makes it.
Charles Murray is a good example of that.
Yeah, why don't you remind the viewers?
Oh, sorry. Charles Murray is a researcher who's done research into IQ differences across different ethnic groups, and his work has been very controversial. He's published books, I think, like The Bell Curve and others, that where he studies IQ differences between men and women, and as well as different ethnic groups. So, of course, mostly not received very well.
Yeah, I would take that back to something you raised earlier about hate speech. It's like you can use it, doesn't mean you should use it. My own feelings about Charles Murray is that it's like, okay, maybe he can do some research and do some findings, but why? What is the purpose of this? What are you trying to establish? Racial superiority? Keep it to yourself. That's not going to help anybody in the world today in order to push an agenda of racial superiority.
But you never do research with the point of establishing something. That's not the point, because then you suffer from confirmation bias. Mm-hmm. What you do is you do the research, and then you draw conclusions from what you find. And I mean, what he found was not, any type of white superiority. He found that the Jews and East Asians were at the very top of the IQ pile. So doesn't look good for.
Well, if he's onto something, I jest. Joke is human. See, this is the problem. Yeah. Okay. Political correctness isn't all. I'm trying to be balanced about this. Political correctness isn't all bad, because what it attempts to do is to instill certain moral or ethical standards upon people in their discourse. There's a value to that. But when it's carried too far and it makes people self-censor so that there's not a free and open exchange of information and ideas, then it's more harmful than helpful. So that's.
I would have to disagree completely. I think political correctness is sort of a way of enforcing completely phony values that have no basis. They're values that are extremely convenient and that will always be applied differently in different situations.
Well, here's the problem, Vera. In terms
because
of
it's politically convenient.
In terms of political philosophy, you would use elections and the legislative process in order to decide. The question is, who decides what's correct speech? And that would be the political process through legislation and the judicial process and such. But it's like, if that is simply a majoritarian process, then that doesn't protect minority rights. And so I do believe that there is a value for minority communities to be.
But the judicial process is not a majority process.
Huh?
The judicial process is
correct. Yeah, correct. So, interesting topic. Anything else we want to say about that?
I think we have a question that Nikita has.
Yes, we have a question from Frederica Hahn.
Yes.
And she asks, What's Cohn's suggestions for a solution? Is the only way to go through face-to-face conversation, or are we doomed?
Well, that's a fallacy of false choice. Again, bifurcating things. It's like again and again and again, because it's like that's the way our minds have been.
Face to face or do.
Huh?
Exactly.
So, there's daunting challenges before us, and there's all sorts of approaches that can be used. Education, media literacy. My own preferred solution is to unplug. If you guys are all addicted to your digital equipment and that it harms more than helps your intellectual development. But it's like, it's easy for like somebody of my generation to advocate that, but this is where you need to step back and recognize the way in which institutions have captured your choice and limited your choice. You need to be online to do so much of the functioning of life today, whether it's buying an airplane ticket or doing your banking or something like
They
that.
want to move voting to online only now.
And so,
It's going to be ridiculous.
No, I disagree with that completely.
anyway, in answer to Freedy, I think that the best solution is for people to, the greatest extent possible, to try to reduce their dependence on technological digital platforms in order to understand the world. Whatever happened to book clubs? Whatever happened to people who would have salons and discuss ideas? In a social context where you're sitting down with people from, it's probably the perfect place for this to happen. You're sitting down with people from different parts of the world, different traditions, different worldviews, and an opportunity to discuss literature, to discuss world events.
Sounds like this table, I think.
It sounds like this table, except when I got here at 5 o'clock, like you asked me to, it took more than a half an hour to be able to begin the discussion, because the whole purpose of this is for you to establish an online presence.
Mm-hmm.
So it's different than the traditional salon or book club.
Well, we are interchanging knowledge, aren't we?
Yeah, but there's an audience. It changes everything.
So does that answer Frederica's question? Any follow-up to that, or we're okay? You see, you can't have a real conversation because people are multitasking. This is the nature of what you're trying to do. It's of value, but I think it would be of greater value if you didn't have all the equipment and multitasking going on, because ultimately it leads to attention deficit disorder for all of y'all.
All right. I think we have another question, sorry.
Oh, good.
More relaxed.
We have another question.
Stop sticking to the points.
Another question comes from Alcest Valtari. And this person...
From St. Valentine?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
Sorry for my pronunciation.
You have
This person asks, if we can choose our pronouns, can we go further and choose our adjectives, nouns, etc.?
Well,
that's the logical progression.
I only respond to his or her majesty, that's it.
Yeah, that's the logical progression, and then everybody's just speaking gibberish because nobody's understanding one another. So it's like, yeah, I get the point of the question, and I think that the question is a good one. Yes, would be my answer, and isn't that messed up? Would be, like my comment on it.
Yeah, what happens to the consensus of language? The whole point of language just disintegrates.
Again, if you put some ears or a smiley face on that piece of equipment, then it would be better for me to look at it. It's like, I'd rather look at you than, but
That's okay, you can
I'm
look
just
at
a
him.
person.
That's okay, you can look at him. It's
Or
fine.
just stupid monkeys.
I actually wanted to come to this. Nice. I actually wanted to come to this other question.
Yeah.
Surveillance.
Surveillance.
I think surveillance impedes freedom of speech. In countries like UK, for example, where the police is all the time watching everybody and what they're doing, freedom of speech is being cut down, I think. And what do you think about that? And what's the line that they should
The
draw?
thing is, when you have constant surveillance, all crimes are being cut down. The problem is if certain types of speech are a crime, then that's the problem. The UK is a joke at this point. Whatever you do, the policeman will drive by and say, do you have a license for that? Like, for example, the case of, although this is Scotland, I mean, this is a bit different. The case of,
It's UK still.
yeah, well, the case of Marcus Meacham, where he did a joke. Maybe you've heard of this.
Remind me.
A Scottish comedian called Marcus Meacham put a video on YouTube where he shows how he taught his dog to Sieg Heil, to annoy his girlfriend, because it's not his dog, it's his girlfriend's dog. It's a cute little pug, and it's the cutest thing she's ever seen, and she loves it, and he wants to piss her off. So he says, I'm going to turn it into the least cute thing I can think of, a Nazi. And so he teaches it to respond enthusiastically to gas the Jews, and to raise its paw when he says Sieg Heil. And he's been in court for 2 years now. So the joke going around is that he's been in court for twice as long as the Nuremberg trials took. And he was sentenced about 3 weeks ago. Oh, no, not sentenced. He was condemned, so he was found guilty, and he will be sentenced next week. So we will know if he will actually do prison time for the joke. And one of the scary things.
And this is where?
This is in Scotland. This really terrifying part of this is that though his defense was built around it was a joke. It was meant as a joke. I explained at the beginning that it is a joke. And the Crown, or the prosecution, said no, we decide the context. The court decides the context. And because he repeated many times in the video, gas the Jews, gas the Jews, gas the Jews, to show his dog reacted enthusiastically to it, they said no reasonable person would not be alarmed and scared for their life by hearing 14 times in a row somebody say gas the Jews. And so there was the whole building around it, and then he tried to defend himself. We decide the context, you do not.
Yeah.
So this is where we are in Europe right now.
So I'll relate that story you just told to what you're asking about the surveillance state, because this goes to the gist of why I feel that it's important to discuss privacy in relation to free speech, especially for our viewers, young people who are, completely unaware that there was a pre-digital age. Basically, you've just been shaped, during.
Pre-digital.
What's that?
We remember the pre-digital age.
You do?
Yeah.
So you're older than 20. You must be at 30 then in order to remember the pre-digital age, to have had conscious.
No.
Right? Okay. So no, you don't remember the pre-digital age.
I remember when it was nothing common.
When nothing what?
When it wasn't something common, where nobody used it, where it was something niche used by nerds in labs.
Yeah. Okay. Right.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Anyway, the point that I think is an important one to make is that, I think it was like former Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall who said, in essence, that if freedom means anything at all, it's the right of a person to read what he wants to read in his own home without any fear of punishment for doing that, in order to develop his thoughts and think what he wants to think, and then to be able to say what he thinks without fear of punishment. And so, the whole nature of the surveillance state brings us into, the George Orwell's 1984 and Big Brother. And then I want to recommend to everybody Glenn Greenwald's TED Talk, Why Privacy Matters. It's an excellent 15-minute discussion of why privacy matters. And he talks about Jeremy Bentham's panopticon model, whereby they use in the prisons, the watchtower is set up in such a way so that it looks out on everybody, and the prisoners can never tell when they're being watched and when they can't, so therefore they have to presume that they're being watched at all times. Well, isn't that the nature of internet surveillance? And so the reason why, why this Scottish comedian got slammed is because he's in Europe. If he was in the United States, he wouldn't be slammed.
Fine.
Huh?
He'd be fine.
He'll be fine.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's just flesh that out for a second. The reason why there's laws against Holocaust denial and praising Hitler is because of the history of Europe. Europe has decided that it is not free speech fundamentalist. It will not allow this sort of hateful speech because of its recent history, and that is why Europe grants greater protection for privacy than free speech relative to the United States. Let me just finish the thought. Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights gives an affirmative fundamental right of every European person to a right to a private life.
Private and family life.
What's that?
It's private and
Right,
family
private and family life.
Yes.
The United States Constitution never mentions the word privacy, which is why the rulings from Griswold to Roe to Bowers v. Hardwick were all kind of like reading tea leaves, establishing something into the Constitution that isn't really there. They talked about the penumbras of privacy emanating from the First, Second, Fourth, Fifth, and Ninth Amendments. Well, it's either there or it isn't. And in terms of like women's abortion rights, I agree with Ruth Bader Ginsburg that it should be an equal protection argument, not a privacy argument. But I think that like the surveillance state is hugely problematic for because it promotes the fear factor, which goes to the false paradigm between liberty and security, where we started this discussion. And you know, there's an article that I use in my with my students called The Whole Haystack, which, you know, pretty well empirically documents that the government is drowning in so much information that it becomes useless. They can't connect the dots or see straight. So it's like it's not an effective law enforcement tool. Obviously, the government's obligation is to secure their people, and so there's a certain amount of surveillance that's needed. I'm glad to see the CCTVs in the metro. I don't want somebody carrying a bomb in their backpack and putting it into a garbage can. I want those cameras there. There are certain things like in airports and mass transit areas where that's great. But I don't want the government or private corporations constantly watching me or my family or anybody in my society. But that's the world that we live in now, so I think the surveillance state is hugely problematic, and it establishes the national insecurity state that we referenced earlier, because it's all about promoting a fear factory. The purpose of it is social control at the end of the day. It's not security. And so it's like, you know, it goes to...
Well, it's the same thing in their minds, really. It's the same thing in their minds.
In whose minds?
In the minds of those who are promoting this. That security of the nation is by having order, controlled order.
Absolutely. I think it's worth noting that, like, you know, in the post-communist world that we're on the border of here, it's like, you know, that there's a movie I want to recommend to people for the history of it. It's called The Lives of Others. It's an East German film that won the Best Foreign Film in the Oscars some years back, and it's really powerful to show the degree to which the Stasi, the East German secret police, were constantly, and this was the nature of communism. You didn't know if somebody who was your neighbor or even in your own family was an informant for the Communist Party.
A third of all Romanian citizens were informants.
Was that?
A third of all Romanian citizens were informants for their secret service.
Yeah.
The network was so wide that literally a third of them were
Right,
spies.
it's the Full Employment Act, I guess. Crazy.
That's slowly
People should be growing food, not spying on one another.
And what they would do is they would give them quotas. So you would have to get quotas of denunciations to fill. So you filled them.
Yeah.
Anyways, the next thing that we have to talk about is...
No, wait, just one thing about the big difference, I think, between European speech laws and the American free speech laws is that in Europe it's speech. Well, first, we don't have free speech, we have freedom of expression. There's slight nuance there. It doesn't cover some things. And it doesn't cover incitements to hatred. It doesn't cover, because you're not expressing yourself, you're creating disorder. You know, there's this sort of very thin nuance there that they've created by using freedom of expression rather than free speech. And then there's also the fact that it's a privilege, not a right, which means that the government can remove it at any time. Some people will think that the European...
Vera, clarify that for me. You're saying that in Europe, free expression, free speech, which are synonymous, to my mind. Because free speech is shorthand for free expression, which means a whole bunch of things.
No, it's the direct translation.
It includes the right not to speak. Free speech, right? That's why you have a right against self-incrimination. You can choose not to cooperate, you know, and testify if you're accused of something. So it's like you're saying that in Europe, that free speech is a privilege, not a right.
Yes, I am.
I'll put
No,
my
no,
context
in the
there.
sense of like, because
If you like
in
to-
Article 10, so there's two sections. So the first one sounds great. It's everyone has the right to freedom of expression. This right shall include freedom to hold opinions and to receive and impart information and ideas without interference by public authority and regardless of frontiers. This article
To
should
impart
not...
information means to be able to speak.
Exactly. This article does not prevent states from requiring licensing broadcasting, television, or cinema enterprises. So, like in Germany now, you need a radio license to have a YouTube channel. But now we come to the second point in the article, which is the exercise of these freedoms, since it carries with it duties and responsibilities, may be subject to such formalities, conditions, restrictions, or penalties as are prescribed by law and are necessary in a democratic society, in the interests of national security, territorial integrity, or public safety, for the prevention of disorder or crime, for the protection of health or morals, for the protection of the reputation or rights of others, for preventing the disclosure of information received in confidence, or for maintaining the authority and impartiality of the judiciary. So basically, you have free speech, but you don't.
May be limited by government.
But I think
In
it's
every
understood.
aspect possible.
I think it's understood overall that free speech is much more free in the US compared to Europe because
Yeah, we
because
talked
of the
about
history.
that
Yes.
in that first
And
podcast.
And do you think that context will ever go away? That Europe has, the context that Europe has about limiting this free speech. For example, a lot of books, Mein Kampf is banned in Germany. That's limiting free speech. And do you think this context will ever go away from Europe, or is it here to stay?
In Europe or
Yes.
in the US?
In Europe, because in the US everybody can propagate anything.
Well, I'll tell you what Oliver Wendell Holmes says about the law, that the law reflects the tradition, history, and culture of the peoples. And so I don't think this is something that goes away in the near term. Who knows what the far future holds. But no, it's like, the law differs in places for very valid reasons because of their history and the values that are informed by that history. So and nor do I think it's appropriate for there to be radical changes to the legal frameworks of different places. It's not a cookie cutter thing. It's not one size fits all.
Right. I think we have a question. Nikita, do you help us out with that?
Yes, we have a question from Andy, who asks if hate speech is just considered words, just as any other type of speech that cannot induce any type of physical harm at its time, so why does it matter? Just let them talk.
Let's just talk.
How can speech induce physical harm? Like they talk to you to death, or like how does that work?
What do you think about that, Mr. Cohn? Do you think that
Sticks and stones shall break my bones, can break my bones, but words can never hurt me? That's essentially what they're saying. Yeah, that's what we learn as kids in the schoolyard, in the sandbox even, right? So it's like, but that's kind of a glib take on things because words do matter. I mean, as scholars and people who care about what words mean, we realize that they impact people, right? But, again, it's law versus ethics. The law says that you can, never mind what the law says. We already covered this. It's different in the US and Europe. But, so.
In the US, we're pretty screwed. I mean, in Europe, sorry.
There's the balance between sensitivity and toughening up, and I don't know what the right balance there is. Everybody's different. But what we need to try to accomplish in society is to increase tolerance through people listening to one another. And that's what's sorely lacking in the digital age, I think, is people...
How can they listen to each other if you have hate speech laws where they end up in prison before people hear them?
Yeah, agreed. I mean, I tipped my hand on this last session when we started this thing. It's like, better the devil I know than the devil I don't know. I still believe in the basic fundamental tenets of free speech fundamentalism as per the US law, but I have a lot of questions about it because I think that there's huge challenges like the digital age, which you haven't really talked about. So we got to talk about social media and Facebook and what's going on in the world now and why it matters for privacy and free speech.
We're
if you
coming
care to.
Yes, of course, we're coming to that. Just after this one other topic.
Anything you want, boss.
Alright. Permanent and...
Can I just check one thing?
Yes.
You're not graying yet. No, you got fuzz on your beard. Fine. You're better now. I fixed
Thank you. Anyways, permanent and temporary damage. Could be psychological, could be self-inflicted damage. Don't you think free speech gives damage which is psychological, or it could be self-induced? For example, there was a mass suicide in Jonestown. Basically, a person convinced a lot of other people.
They drank the Kool-Aid.
Yes.
Jim Jones. I
Yes,
remember
Jim
well.
Yes. And don't you think that's a big problem for free speech? And
What's the connection? Like, you mean Jim Jones
it's,
should be allowed
no,
to
you
speak?
said, you said that there is no connection between
I love you, Naveen. Your
violence,
questions are bizarre. I love it.
violence and speech. This is the connection, don't you think?
Well, I mean, they're committing suicide. Like
It's ideological subversion. Like you're changing
Okay,
their
okay,
ideology
I mean-
so that they're inflicting harm on themselves, and that's also it comes under free speech.
Yeah, but I mean, he's not forcing the Kool-Aid down their throats. I mean, like they're still drinking it themselves. I mean, these people have been deluded into drinking it, but his words are not causing violence.
So just
Well, it's
because
not that simple because you could analogize this to somebody who tells a poor person from a Muslim country who's desperate and hopeless. If you strap these explosives onto yourself, we're going to take care of your family and you're going to go to heaven and have be in paradise and stuff. So
Well, that's different because you're paying him to blow himself up. You're supplying the strap-on bomb. You're supplying the money that goes to the family. I mean, you're paying people to commit terrorism. That's different.
okay, maybe it's just a promise of paradise in the next life.
Well, yeah, he's an idiot for believing it.
Yeah, I mean it's like
I understand that it's not always.
we want to protect the stupid. I mean,
Yeah, exactly.
the
That's
law
what
is
I'm talking
largely intended to protect
even the stupid.
But we can't assume.
Nobody ever believes it.
We can't assume that people are stupid because then it's like, why are we in a democracy at this
But
point?
how can you?
Democracy is problematic, frankly.
Exactly.
How
Like,
can you
if people are stupid,
Yeah.
like if we're in a democracy, we have to assume people have the intelligence to function in a democracy.
There's
Otherwise,
a
it's just
valid
like-
debate to be had whether democracy is the best form of government, and it's been going on forever, and it's still relevant today. But everybody's singing from the same hymn book. It's like, look at Egypt, right? Everybody calls themselves a democracy because that's the label of the day. And it's like, democracy doesn't exist in the world today except in Scandinavia and Canada, so far as I can tell.
in Canada.
Well, I'm
In Canada, really.
huh?
In Canada.
Why do you think?
What's wrong with Canada?
Well, I mean, you can go to prison for misgendering someone. I mean, I didn't call that.
Okay, whatever. Next topic.
Anyways, so wider audience.
But I hear you. Because even the best societies have things we can critique, and then it's not a democracy because it's not perfect. Utopia doesn't exist and it never will.
Yeah.
It's simply an aspiration. And I don't know the best way to aspire towards it because, whatever.
Let's move on to the digital age,
Good.
as you were anticipating for a long time. Yes. Now, one of the main problems. Okay. One of the main problems with the digital age is that it gives you a huge audience, and so the responsibility that comes with your speech, however stupid or intelligent you are, as we were talking about earlier, it elevates to a place where you have to be intelligent to know what you are saying because you have a wider reach. So this, I think, digital age is sort of impeding on freedoms, and it's changing our dynamics of what freedoms are and what security is.
How does it impede on your freedom? Like, you have much more range than ever before.
I understand, but the freedom to have your own opinion change because of the social circles that you live in, and basically with a wider audience, you start watching what your peers watch.
No, but I mean, with the internet, you have access to whatever you want. Before, people only had access to what the people around them had access to. Now, people have access to whatever they want.
But that's a problem, don't you think?
No, why?
Because
It's the paradox of capitalism, too much choice. Right?
Like, people are like 26 and they still don't know what they're going to do.
Anyway, it's like Internet ideals versus the e-commerce culture that we live in. That's what it's about. I refer people to my article, A Tangled Web, that I wrote some years ago. The internet ideals were that, the World Wide Web was the world's greatest democratizing force because it allowed people from all corners of the globe to share information and ideas, and this would help to solve societal problems.
But it's also creating new societal problems.
Yeah, but
For example,
it was inevitable that there was going to be transformations and changes that occurred. I think, we talked about a lot of this in the first podcast, should we consider it a public utility? Should we just allow it to be a privatized sphere? I mean, I'll just share with you my big concern in order to get this up to the present. The problem with Facebook, Amazon, and Google is that they've seized control of the web by their monopoly power over their powerful platforms. And absent competition, there's no incentive for them to continue to provide innovation to deliver to users the best quality of services and apps and information and ideas, because as we all know, a monopoly has no incentive to innovate or do anything different. And the question was raised, a couple days ago when one of the senators was pushing Zuckerberg on whether or not, Facebook is a monopoly. And Zuckerberg was saying, no, it's not a monopoly.
No, he said, well, it doesn't feel like that. It doesn't feel like that to me.
Yeah, right. After he was talking about email services, but that's not what they do. In terms of social media, they occupy the space. And so, it's
but
like, when he said that,
space.
everybody in the room laughed because they recognized that, this is a joke. Like, he couldn't give an example of
Competition in the same domain.
An alternative that those who wish to use social media could, So it's like, I think the problem is a lack of competition in terms of the powerful players in Silicon Valley, and the bigger problem is that government doesn't want to regulate the way it needs to, because they're looking to Silicon Valley to self-regulate in order to maintain privacy things. It's like, the Cambridge Analytica thing, it's like it speaks to, the ability of politicians to use these tools for very cynical, manipulative reasons. You psychology students have surely, studied the way in which these ideas were developed.
But how is that different from, pre-campaign research? Like you're studying the psychological profile of the people you're targeting. Like how is that different from just, going to different towns, 100 years ago and, speaking to the people and getting to know them?
Focus groups.
Oh yes.
Because there's a lack of consent.
Well, they consented to have their information on Facebook.
They filled out the questionnaire, they consented, but they didn't know that Facebook and Cambridge Analytica were enabling their friends and the friends of their friends.
Yeah, but why have I known since 2008?
I mean, how many?
I mean, like I knew this stuff about 2008. People need to be better informed. Like this is nothing.
See, that's again, we're coming back to the argument that, like, are you a good
you know what you're signing?
So you don't believe in democracy? I'm just trying to take this to its logical conclusion. You don't believe in democracy. You believe that people, the origins of, much of democratic stuff was that it was people who were educated and had property who were allowed to make decisions for society. So, you're educated. I don't know if you own property, but what are your views on that? I'm just trying, I'm trying to relate this to what we were talking about before. So if most people don't have the ability to figure stuff out for themselves,
I don't think that
should they be empowered?
I disagree with that. They don't have the ability. It's just they don't bother.
They don't bother.
They don't bother because for one, their awareness is not raised about the issue, and secondly, sometimes they're just lazy. And then they have other stuff to do. Their lives going on.
Yeah.
But I mean, you just look into it a little bit. If you accept something.
But the genius of the web is that it's actualized Aldous Huxley's thesis that you don't need to overtly oppress people, because if you give them the games and tools to kind of make themselves lazy and dumb and just to enjoy their video games and whatever it is that people do, they will imprison themselves because they will not seek to hold those in power to account because they're so happy with their pornography, with their video games, with their online gaming, with their YouTube. I mean, you know, how many hours can you waste on YouTube in a day? A lot. How many people waste a lot of hours on YouTube every day? Can we blame them for that? Does that make them unworthy? You need to step back and recognize the need. Huh?
No, I don't say they're unworthy. Like, I don't think so. It's just like people should simply be better informed. In the sense that people should make the effort.
Yes, they should.
Because
will they?
unfortunately, the effort doesn't exist in the culture.
No, I think this takes us to the education system and how it's flawed. So
I mean,
basically,
like, I'm an idiot, so if I can do it, I mean, anybody can.
how the digital age is changing,
I hear you.
how the digital age is changing our world. I don't think everybody's educated enough about it. So I think it has to be included in the curriculum.
Like, I mean, like, you know, everybody's uneducated about something. You know, like, we're all ignorant in some way or another, but it's, how to say, I mean, this is like basic stuff. This is like how to find a job, how to know, you know, how media literacy, you know, these sort of basic things you should be taught maybe in school or something. I don't know. Maybe state school is always a bad solution, but
Yeah.
I mean, this is something that has to enter the culture, you know,
Yeah, okay, let me promote the Bill Cohn Full Employment Act. It should be mandatory for all students to have courses in media literacy, critical thinking,
No, but that's the
financial
problem.
literacy.
But exactly, but that's the problem, is we can't enforce this like this from the top down. It's not going to work. Because first of all, we'll have a bunch of bored students who are not going to absorb anything.
Yeah, now people are becoming aware of it though. I think people
Yeah.
are realizing that they're lost in the spin cycle and that they want their kids to be able to have the skills to be able to sift through it. So you know that's happening. I want to comment on one thing about Facebook. Like I sent Naveen you know earlier a series of links to articles which are really interesting. One of the pieces of information in one of the articles is that it's like okay, firstly, for 15 years, Mark Zuckerberg has been on an apology tour. Scandal after scandal after scandal.
I've seen the compilations.
Apology and apology. This is from Wired, I think that one.
Starting from Face Smash, no?
Yeah, right, yeah.